Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 268, The Peak and the Pit. Today we're going down below chapels, schools, factories, and terraces, below the winding gears and the coal trams, into the black seam that made at least some of Wales rich, and made Wales famous, and, as always, made Wales grieve. Our story runs from 1890 to 1913, the period that we've been covering for the last few episodes. From a coal field already vast and confident to the single year in which it reached its very summit of its power, 1913. The year Welsh coal output hit a peak that it would never see again. It is also the year in October of those same triumphant 12 months that industry produced the worst catastrophe in the history of British mining. Senghenydd. 443 men and boys lost their lives. The peak and the pit arriving together in the same year, that is the subject today. But running underneath all of it is one hard question. In a quarter of a century of explosions, of floods, of falling roofs, poison air, how much did anyone actually learn, and how much was simply repeated and tragically ignored? So, let us get started. To understand what happened in 1913, we have to understand the world that produced it, and that means beginning with the coal field itself, and coal on its own. The South Wales coal field was the largest continuous coal field in Britain. It stretched roughly 1,000 square miles, from Pembrokeshire in the west to Monmouthshire in the east, a great crescent of carboniferous rock folded into steep valleys of the south. In the west, it produced anthracite, but in the central valleys, the Rhondda, the Cynon, and the Rhymney, it held treasure that made Wales matter to the whole world: steam coal. Welsh steam coal was not just any coal. It was high in carbon and low in sulfur and low in ash, meaning it burned hot and burned clean. It left little smoke behind. For a navy that did not want to advertise its position, a plume of black smoke on the horizon would, of course, give them away, so that this very thing was priceless. The Royal Navy ran on Welsh steam coal. So did the merchant fleets across the globe. The coaling stations of the British Empire, from Gibraltar to Port Said to Aden and to Singapore, were stacked with the coal hewn from beneath the Welsh valleys. By 1890, when our story opens, this was already one of the greatest industrial regions on Earth. The coal came down from the pitheads by rail, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, in an endless procession of trucks, to the great export docks at Cardiff, at Bury, at Swansea, at Newport, and Penarth. And in Cardiff stood the beating heart of the whole enterprise, the coal exchange in Mount Stuart Square. It was here, on a crowded trading floor, where many of the 200 men might be shouting and gesticulating during peak hours around midday. That was where the price of the world's coal was set, not in London, not in New York, but in Cardiff. The stories that cling to that building tell you everything about the scale of the money involved. It was here in the early years of the 20th century, around 1904, as the tale is usually told, that the first £1 million business deal in history was struck, and the first £1 million check was signed. The coal it bought was bound for France, a single check for a sum most people of the age could scarcely imagine, written for Welsh coal, the, I guess, equivalent to writing $1 billion check today. But coal was not dug by checks, it was dug by men, and so the other half of this story obviously is human, and it was that the people came in a great flood. In 1800, Welsh coal industry had employed perhaps 1,500 people. By 1864, that had risen to 30,000. By 1913, it would employ around 250,000 men and boys. Between 1851 and 1911, the population of the coalfield rose by more than 300,000 people, drawn from rural Wales, from English West Country, and from the Forest of Dean, from Ireland, and from wherever work was scarce and the valleys promised a wage. The Rhondda tells the story in miniature. In the middle of the 19th century, it had been a scattering of farms and sheepwalks, a quiet upland valley, but by 1913 it was one of the most densely populated industrial districts on the planet. A continuous ribbon of terraced housing, colliery headgear, and chapel after chapel after chapel. This was a new society, raw and crowded and built in a hurry, and it was built on coal. None of this would have been possible without the docks, and the docks were, to a remarkable degree, the creation of ambition and rivalry. We've talked a lot about this in the past. We've talked about the advent of the Marquis of Bute and how he became one of the big owners of these docks. And basically, from the 1830s onward, he controlled quite a lot of this territory, which spending the money he made there, amongst other things, in rebuilding Cardiff Castle, in modifying and producing the version of Castell Coch that we see today, and then also was key in preservations around Caerphilly. Rightly or wrongly, as we've mentioned in the past, he was a bit of a ham-fisted archaeologist, shall we say. However, he was important. And of course, at Barry, we had David Davies, who, to break the Buttes' trade in the area, had developed his own series of docks and to help coal reach the sea, From there, of course, from these docks, it went everywhere. The British Empire ran on a global chain of coaling station deposits where the imperial and merchant shipping refueled for long routes between the continents. And that chain was stocked link after link with Welsh coal. When you read that the sun never sets on the British Empire, you might equally say that the fires under its boilers never went out. And a great many of those fires were fed by Welsh coal. From 1890 onward, the only direction was up. Output climbed, and through the 1890s and into a new century, the pits were deeper and raised more until 1913. The South Wales coal fields produced 56.5 million tons of coal on a single year. To put that into perspective, this one region was raising roughly a fifth of all the coal mined in Britain and employed roughly a fifth of all the British miners. It had overtaken the great coal fields of the northeast of England, and it was, by any measure, one of the largest and most important coal fields in the world. And most of it left. This was not coal for the Welsh hearths. It was an export economy, and a staggering one. Welsh steam coal fueled steamships in Buenos Aires, in Genoa, in Bombay, and in Shanghai. By 1913, the little town of Barry had become the single largest coal exporting port in the entire world, with Cardiff close behind it in second place. A small nation on the western edge of Europe was helping to power the industry and navy of half the globe. Now, we can talk about whether that's right or wrong. We can talk about the environmental cost, but nonetheless, it is an important part of the history of Wales, and it's something we have to make mention of because of how critical it was to the Welsh economy at the time. But of course, here's the thing about that relentless climb. The easy coal went first. The shallow seams near the surface were worked out, and to keep the output rising, the pits had to go deeper, especially in the central coal fields in the 1870s onwards, down in the deep reserves beneath the valleys. The deeper coal is more dangerous coal, of course. It is hotter. It gives off more gas. The very geology that produced the finest steam coal in the world also produced some of the most treacherous working conditions in the world. The prize and peril came from the same rock. Sitting above it all were the owners. The Edwardian coalfields were increasingly a place of consolidation, where individual collieries were being swallowed into large combines, corporate structures that could manage prices and hold down wages across whole districts. We've talked a bit about this. We met the most famous of them in our episode on Tony Pandy, the Cambrian Combine, controlled by industrialist and liberal politician D.A. Thomas, later Lord Rhondda. The miners were paid by the ton on piece rates. with much of the preparatory work, such as the timbering and the clearing, counted as unpaid dead work. Every incentive in the system pushed towards one thing: get the coal out and get it out cheaply. And the deeper truth of this economy that it was fragile. Whole valleys, whole towns, and whole populations now depended on a single commodity sold in a single volatile world market. When coal prices were high, the valleys boomed, and wages tied to those prices, through the notorious sliding scale, of course, rose with them. When prices fell, same families felt the floor drop away beneath them. It was a monoculture of coal, magnified and precarious in equal measure. It was bound in the fate of 250,000 households to the fortunes of the black seam below it. Hold that thought, of course, because it is key to everything that follows. The same drive for output that built fortunes and filled the coal exchange was the drive that multiplied the risk underground. Wealth and danger were not opposition. They were compatriots. They were effectively two readings of the same figure. So with that in mind, let us go down into the coal face and see what the work actually was. We've talked a little bit about coal mining in the past, about the cost, about the effort, about some of the work of it, but I want to go into further detail now. A collier's day began in the dark and ended in the dark. He descended in a cage, sometimes 600 meters or more, into a world of heat and dust and the constant creak of roofs settling overhead. He worked often in partnership or a small team, hewing at seams by the light of a lamp, filling trams with coal, setting timber props to hold up the roof that he was undercutting. It was skilled, brutal, and physical labor done in cramped and airless space, and it was paid by how much he could fill. It was not only grown men down there. The pit, even at this point in time, ran in a whole hierarchy of labor. There were hauliers who drove the horses and the trams, the door boys who sat alone in the dark to open and close the ventilation doors, the young lads learning the trade at their father's elbow. Boys went underground young, and the 14-year-olds at the coal face were no rarity at all. The women, by contrast, were barred from working underground since the Mines and Colliery Act of 1842, though they did labor hard enough at the surface and harder still in keeping households that the pit consumed. And above the collier stood the fireman or the examiner, the man whose task it was to go into each district before the shift with his safety lamp and test for gas, watching for low flame of the lamp lengthen and change its shape in the presence of the fire damp. On his diligence and on the honesty of the report he made hung the lives of every man and boy who followed into that mine. And it was surrounded on every side by ways to die. There was fire damp, the miner's name for methane, the invisible gas that seeps out of coal and mixed with the air in wrong proportions. It needs only a spark to explode. There was coal dust so fine it hangs in the air, which we'll come back to, because coal dust is the quiet villain of this whole story. There were roof falls, the crushing collapse of stone from above, which killed more men across the years than any single explosion. There was haulage accidents, men caught in the trams and in the ropes in the dark. There was flooding and the risk of inrush of water into the workings. We've talked a bit about one of the incidents where exactly that happened. And after any explosion, there was the after damp, the poisonous aftermath of a mixture of gases heavy in carbon monoxide that suffocated the blood's ability to carry oxygen. Many who survived the blast of an explosion died in the silence afterwards from the very air itself. Now, the great disasters are what history remembers, but it is worth pausing on the grimmer arithmetic. Day after day, week after week, the coalfield killed men in ones and twos. A single collier crushed under a fall here, 2 men gassed in the heading there. These deaths, of course, rarely made the national newspaper. They were local griefs, absorbed by a street, a chapel, a family. Yet added together year upon year, they claimed far more lives than all of the famous explosions combined. South Wales was statistically the most dangerous coalfield in what was the most dangerous industry in Britain. The figures are stark. In the 2 decades between 1880 and 1900, South Wales had around 18% of Britain's miners, yet it accounted for close to half of all mining deaths in the entirety of the United Kingdom. Go down the pit was to accept a running gamble with your life every single shift. And even the men in the pit who did not get killed outright were often killed slowly. The coal dust that we mentioned earlier filled lungs over decades of labor, brought chronic diseases, breathlessness, and the wasting that would later be named as monoconesis and silicosis, conditions that South Wales would suffer more grievously than almost anywhere else in Britain. In the mining districts, life was, on average, simply shorter, and that was the price quietly paid and continuously so that never appeared on any check at a coal exchange. If the daily toll was a slow bleed, the explosions were the hammer blows, and in the quarter century before 1913 they came again and again. In June of 1894, the Albion Colliery in Senghenydd, an explosion killed around 290 men and boys, one of the worst in the coalfields yet seen at that point, just a few miles from where our story will end. Then in May of 1901, at a pit called the Universal Colliery, in a village called Senghenydd, an explosion killed 81 men. Only one man in the affected district survived. I want you to hold on to that name and that year, Senghenydd, 1901, 81 dead, because we're going to return to that exact pit, and this first disaster was a warning that hung over everything that comes after it. In 1890, the very year our story opens, the Llanars Colliery at Abersinchan had exploded and killed around 176 people. And in July of 1905, at the National Colliery in Wattstown, another explosion killed 119. The list goes on, a steady drumbeat of catastrophe running underneath the rising output figures like a bass note beneath a bright melody. And beyond Wales, in 1906, came catastrophes that shook entire European coal industry. The Conres disaster in northern France, where more than 1,000 miners died in a single explosion, the worst in European history. Conres horrified the world, and it did something practical too. It drove home across every coal-producing nation the desperate need for organized, trained mine rescue, for men equipped with breathing apparatus which could go into the poisoned air where ordinary rescuers would simply die. In the years that followed, rescue stations began to be established across the British coalfields, and South Wales among them. And there was a bitter irony in that timing, which sits at the very center of our episode. The lessons about how to rescue men after an explosion were being learned, even as the lessons about how to prevent the explosion in the first place continued to go unheeded. Looking at these disasters together, a pattern emerges, a signature repeated over and over. Very often it began with modest ignitions of fire damp. A pocket of gas catches flame that alone might kill a few men, but then the flame reaches the coal dust lying thick on the floor and the ledges and timbers of the workings, and the dust took the fire and carried it, exploding along mile after mile of tunnel, a rolling wave of flame and pressure tearing through the whole pit. The gas lit the match, but the dust had turned the local accident into a massacre, and it matters enormously for what is about to happen. Here's the part of the story where it turns into tragedy. And honestly, with all of these mining disasters, quite likely it comes down to human failure, and human failure is at the source and root of most of it. Because, of course, by 1913, Everyone had a knowledge of how to solve most of the issues. The remedies existed and the laws existed and were failed to be enforced, and the remedies were failed enforcement, which created most of the issue. Take the coal dust, for example. Through the 1900s, driven partially by the shocks of Courier, the science of coal dust explosion was worked out in detail, including through the Royal Commission on Mines, which sat from 1906 to 1911. Experiments demonstrated that dry coal dust could propagate an explosion even where there was little gas at all. And crucially, it showed the remedy. You could water the workings to keep the dust down. You could apply stone dust, spreading inert, non-flammable stone dust through the mine so that it smothered any flame before it could spread. Stone dusting worked, and this was known. Ventilation, on the other hand, had another method. Everyone understood that the answer to fire damp was air, a strong controlled current of fresh air sweeping continuously through the workings to dilute and carry away the gas. It was understood, too, that after an explosion, you might urgently need to reverse that airflow to drive fresh air towards the trapped men and push the deadly after damp away from them. A ventilation system that could reverse the directions was a system that could save lives in crucial hours after the blast. Then, of course, there was the ignition sources. It was known at that time that naked flame had no place in gassy pits, that miners should work by locked safety lamps, and that any electrical equipment underground had to be approved type that could not throw a spark into an explosive atmosphere. And of course, we need to talk about the rescuers. After Kurez, the case for permanent, properly equipped rescue stations with trained teams was overwhelmingly important and widely accepted. All of this was gathered up and written into law in the great consolidating statute of the era, the Coal Mines Act of 1911, which came into force in December of that year, nearly 2 years before the incident. It was a landmark legislation. It laid down specifically that ventilation fans at every colliery had to be capable of reversing underground air current. Mines were given deadlines to comply. That works was to be done by the 1st of January 1913. But a law was only as strong as its enforcement, and here lay the weakness, and something that would be a constant weakness when it came to the enforcement of coal safety and mine safety. And of course, because of that, it proved fatal. The Mines Inspectorates, the body that charged with policing the safety of hundreds of collieries and 250,000 men in South Wales alone, was small and stretched thin and markedly reluctant to reach for a blunt instrument of prosecution against powerful, well-lawyered companies. An inspector might find a fault, note it, and write it to the management, grant time for it to be put right, and move on to the next of the scores of pits in his charge. The whole system ran on the assumption of good faith by the owners. Where that good faith failed, the state's response was slow and its teeth were few. So, let's be absolutely clear about where we stand as we approach the autumn of 1913. The danger was understood, the science of prevention was also understood, and an act of Parliament, legislation needed, commanded the necessary safeguards with a deadline. Everything that was needed to prevent a catastrophe by 1913 was a matter of settled knowledge and settled law. What remained was whether there was anyone who could actually make it happen. And there we lead to the final hammer blow. Senghenydd sits in the Aber Valley to the north of Caerphilly. In 1913, it was a village of just under 6,000 people, and it lived and breathed by one thing, the Universal Colliery. The pit had been sunk in 1891 by the Universal Steam Coal Company, itself part of the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Colliery Combine. It had two shafts, the Lancaster and the York, going down nearly 600 meters into the earth, and it worked the prize and gassy steamed coal, and it was, remember, the same pit that had killed 81 men in 1901, just basically 10 years after they founded the thing. On the morning of Tuesday, the 14th of October in 1913, around 950 men and boys were underground for the early shift. About 10 minutes past 8, the pit exploded. The best reconstruction from the inquiry that followed is the signature we have already learned to recognize. A spark, most probably from electrical signaling gear, ignited an accumulation of fire damp. Redmayne, in his official report, put the likely cause with careful precision. The only apparent means of ignition, he concluded, would be the sparks of electrical signaling apparatus, or from the rocks brought down by a fall. And then the flame found coal dust, and the coal dust did what coal dust does. The explosion tore through the workings with unimaginable force. It was violent enough to hurl a 2-ton cage back up the shaft and wreck the pit head at the surface. Down below, hundreds of men were killed before they even knew what was happening. By a blast, by the fire, by the falls of stones, and by the afterdamp that would then follow. The numbers are almost impossible to consider. 439 men and boys died that morning. One more, a rescuer, would give his life in the days that followed, bringing the toll to 440. Some of the bodies were never recovered at all, and it was, and it remains, the worst mining disaster in the history of the British coalfields. But the numbers, terrible as they are, do not reach the heart of it. So, let's talk about the human arithmetic instead. Some of the most difficult and awkward conversations that we can have, obviously. Whenever you have conversations about disasters like this, whenever there's something that causes so much suffering and grief, there's always a cost that goes outside of just the people who suffered. And that's something to keep in mind with these conversations. The disaster left 442 children without a father. It made widows of more than 200 women. Of the dead, 60 were under the age of 20, and 8 of those were just 14-year-old boys who should not have been anywhere near that pit. In a village of 6,000 souls, more than 1,000 people were bereaved. One chapel is said to have lost 60% of its male members in a single morning. There was scarcely a household untouched. Unfortunately, this is going to be an experience for the next 5 years, but through World War I. But this is an incident which is not about a war. It's not about fighting. It's about negligence and willingness to earn financial gain over safety and consequence. At the surface, the scenes were ones you can imagine, and of course we don't want to witness. Families gathering at the pit head, waiting. Rescue teams came from across the coalfield, and they labored for 3 weeks, hindered at every turn by fire and by the poison of the afterdamp. When men were brought up alive, each survivor was met with great cheer from the crowd. The last of the survivors was pulled out around a fortnight after the blast. Then the cheers grew rarer and eventually stopped as the pit gave up its dead instead of its living. The work of identifying the dead was its own quiet horror. Bodies were brought to the surface over many days, and in a pit where the blast and the fire had done their worst, families searched for anything that might name their man. A scrap of clothing, a tool with an initial scratched into it, a watch that had stopped on the hour of the explosion. In the collection of the National Museum of Wales survives one such watch, recovered from a body used to identify a man who could only be known by nothing else. Multiply that single stopped watch by hundreds, and you only begin to grasp what that one October morning did to one small valley. And over all of it hung that earlier date. This community had already buried men once before in 1901. It had already been warned, in the plainest of language, that a coalfield can speak, which is the language of the dead. And yet here it is again. So what happened next? What did the law, the state, and the industry do with a catastrophe of this scale? Well, as you would expect, first came the inquest, held in the village from early January 1914. It ran for 7 days and asked where the explosion had begun. The jury found there was, in their words, insufficient evidence to answer definitively, and on the deaths themselves, they returned a verdict of accidental death. Accidental. As you can imagine, that comment, that idea, did not go over well. And then, of course, came the official inquiry conducted by R.A.S. Redmayne, the chief inspector of the mines. It sat for the best part of a month, and it produced 2 enormous volumes of evidence, and what Redmayne found is the crux of the entire episode. He found that the ventilation had not been made reversible as the Coal Mine Act of 1911 required, and by the deadline of January 1913 specifically. Indeed, the mine inspectorate had already granted the colliery an extension, pushing the deadline out to September 1913, 1 month before the incident. Even then, the work had not been done. The single legal safeguard most directly designated to save men's lives in the aftermath of an explosion had been left undone, past one deadline and then past yet another. He found problems with the control of coal dust, the very hazard science had by now thoroughly understood. He found electrical apparatus and signaling of the kind that would throw fatal sparks into a pit known to give off gas. He found, too, that the men charged with the daily inspection for gas had been given far too much ground to cover in far too little time. Then historian Michael Levin, who studied this disaster in its fullest, records that the company considered any other form of inspection to be, in Levin's phrase, too time-consuming. In short, he found a colliery where the knowledge and the law of 1913 had simply not been translated into practice on the ground, and behind it all stood the warning of 1901 in that same pit, unheeded, grasping for financial gain, concern about getting enough coal to make it valuable, was the only real guidance. Of course, just because that's the running thread doesn't mean we have, the mustachio twirling manager who, was completely unwilling to take his men's safety into regard. Edward Shaw, the manager of the mine, was considered honest, industrious, and in many respects an active manager. Shaw himself went down into the pit in the immediate aftermath and worked to try and reach the trapped men. Redmayne praised him and the small band who went with him. This isn't a tale of evil men and their designs, but it is something worse in reality. It is the entire system, the entire focus, which drove them to cut corners, to create a normalcy in not being safe. By doing that and having weak enforcement to go along with it, it meant that people failed to get the life-saving equipment that they were required to have. It meant that there was a lapse in judgment in towards getting things done, and the fact that there was an eager and easy example of what had happened only 11 years or 12 years prior to that had been failed to follow up on. And nobody in power at the time really paid attention, really, in all honesty, considered the consequence of doing nothing. And then, of course, came the reckoning in law. In May of 1914, the manager, Edward Shaw, was charged with 17 offenses under the Coal Mine Act, and the owners, Lewis Merthyr Company, with 4. Shaw was convicted on 8 of his charges and fined a total of £24 for the single charge most closely tied to the catastrophe, the failure to clear away the coal dust. He was fined £5. The company was convicted on only 1 charge, the failure to fit the reversible ventilation fans the law had demanded, and they were fined £10. And here we reach the detail, more than any other, that tells you how the age valued a collier's life. £24 and £10 for 440 dead. That is laughable. Even at that time, even at that age where, £40 was probably more like 400, it's still ridiculous. It's still nonsensical. A contemporary newspaper did the arithmetic that it echoed ever since. 24 pounds divided amongst 439 men killed that morning came to about 1 shilling and a penny's farthing per life. In the money of the day, roughly the price of a round of drinks. That was the cost of a miner's life, the phrase went, valued at 1 shilling and a penny farthing each. To this day, the National Museum of Wales tells this story under the title, quote, The Miners' Lives at 5.5 pence each, end quote. A modern decimal rendering of the same obscene little sum. The response across the coalfield, as you can imagine, was fury, and it was an articulate fury. The anger at the disaster fed straight into the radical current that we've been following in other episodes. The world of the miners' next step, the Independent Labour Party, Keir Hardie and the members of the Merthyr Tydfil and Aberdare and Merthyr Pioneer that his allies ran gave voice to the communities that read in that derisory fine a plain and public statement of exactly where it stood in the order of things. Relief did come, however, to the bereaved. A national fund and public subscription raised money for the widows and fatherless children, and that money mattered enormously to the bare survival. But the charity, however generous, could not answer the deeper charge. The charge that was that a colliery could break the safety law with something close to impunity, kill 440 men and boys, and be made to pay less than the value of the coal it raised in a single hour. So the question this episode set out to ask, were there lessons learned and lessons failed? Let's be fair and count both. Some lessons genuinely were learned. In the years that followed stone dusting, the smothering of coal dust with inert dust, that the science had proven became the standard practice across British coalfields. It saved lives that we cannot count because the explosions that would have killed them never came. Mine rescue provision continued to expand and professionalize. The disaster fed into the long, slow tightening of regulation and inspection that across the 20th century would eventually make the pits far safer places than they were in 1913. The dead were not entirely without legacy. But the failures are the ones that ought to keep us honest. The knowledge was there and was not applied. The law was there and not enforced, let's be honest. A deadline written to save lives was missed twice. At a pit already marked by death, the response of the state was a warning letter and an extension. When the worst happened, the penalty priced a man's life below a day's wage. Behind it all sat the logic we traced back to the very first section of this episode. Same logic that was met in other disasters, an industry built to extract, to export, and to profit, in which tonnage came first and safety came a distant, negotiable second. The tragedy of the disaster was not that nobody knew how to prevent it. The tragedy was that everybody did, and it happened anyway. And so, of course, we come back to where we began, to the strange and terrible symmetry of the year of 1913. For this was the summit, 56.5 million tons of coal in a single year, 250,000 men and boys, the world's price set at the trading floors in Cardiff, the world's busiest coal port at Barry, the Welsh steam coal in the bunkers of the ships on every ocean. Never before and never again would Wales raise so much coal. 1913 was the high watermark for king coal and the very peak of an industry that had remade the nation for over 100 years. It was also the year of the biggest disaster, the peak of wealth and the worst of horror arriving together in the same 12 months. I've tried throughout this episode to persuade you that this was not a coincidence. I hope by now one point is clear. The boom and the catastrophe were not separate stories. They were one story of the same industry seen from two different places, from the boardroom of the coal exchange to the coal face in the 1,000 feet below the Aber Valley. And of course, the tide was about to turn, although few could see it or understand it. Within a year, of course, Europe would be at war. The very navy that the Welsh steam coal had fueled would steam out into that war, and the men of the valleys and the survivors of the disaster and their sons would march off in their thousands. And in the longer aftermath would come the move to oil-fired ships, the loss of the export market, and the grinding decline that would hollow these very same valleys within a generation, bringing poverty and unemployment where there had once been a roar of the winding gear, and the high tide of 1913 would recede, and it would keep on receding. On October 2013, 100 years to the month after the disaster, a Welsh National Mining Memorial was unveiled at the site of the old Universal Colliery pithead. It remembers the dead, and through them, the dead of all Welsh mining disasters. It shows a rescue worker bending down and reaching out his hand to one of the survivors of the explosion. A hand reaching for another hand. And it is, I think, the exact correct image. Because coal built modern Wales, it is built the cities, the docks, the chapels, and the choirs, the reading rooms and the rugby clubs, and the fierce, proud politics of the valleys that we have traced across so many episodes of this podcast. All of this was bought with coal, and all of it was paid for, ton by ton and man by man, in the currency that no check at the coal exchange ever recorded, and no fine of 24 pounds could ever settle. That is the peak, and that is the pit, and they are, in the end, the same place. And with all that, I would like to actually give my thanks to the work of the National Museum of Wales and the Aber Valley Heritage Group for keeping these stories and for telling them, because I think it helps us understand better what this means and how important it is to remember these things. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns that you want to express, you can do so at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. If you have any business propositions you'd like to make, there as well. If you just want to reach out to me in other ways, you can do so usually on social media at Welsh History Pod. That is the case on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. However, on Facebook, we're facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Also, you can join our Patreon if you want to help out. The next episode is coming next week on our roaming around Roman Britain. So please consider becoming a member. It does help. And if you want, please give a like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or I know other people watch it in other ways. So thank you very much. Once again, thank you all. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Diolch yn fawr. Thanks a lot. Bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.